Welcome to Inexpensive Arms. My name's Steve. More pew, less money, no bull. Today we're going to be continuing a series, and this is the Accurizing your AR on the cheap, and we're going to take a look at the trigger. So in the past we've done accu wedges, we've done how to shim a barrel. This is another component to accuracy, and that is having a halfway decent trigger. Now, we're not going to be working on making something match grade. It's not really possible with a GI trigger. But what you can do is turn a crappy 8 or 9 pound GI trigger into a pretty decent 5 pound or 4.5 pound crisp trigger that has a positive reset and is just decent all the way around. Alright, so there's a lot of guys that will invest $100 in a drop-in trigger, and those are great. Or more in a drop-in trigger, and there's nothing wrong with that. That'll improve your shooting experience quite a bit. There is a cheaper way to do things, so I'm going to go over my current go-to and what I do and show you why. Alright, so what I have installed, this is just a basic GI kit with a MOE grip from Magpul. I love these grips. I always upgrade every single AR I have to these, or a LaRue grip. But what we have here is a Anderson lower parts kit with the stainless hammer and trigger, a JPE reduced power enhanced reliability spring set, which costs about $15, and about $5 of screws and bolts that we're using to adjust the trigger itself. And I'm going to show you what the trigger looks like right now. Take that there. As you can see, I'm pushing the trigger. We got a nice clean break with very little creep, and I'm going to reset it. We have a nice short reset. Okay, this trigger feels honestly like about an $80 drop-in trigger. I've got drop-in triggers that I bought in the past, and this feels pretty darn close. Maybe not quite as tight of a reset and not quite as crisp as a break, but very close. And this entire lower parts kit, complete with the springs and the trigger adjuster that got it there, only cost me about $50 right on the nose. $47 plus about $3, $4 in bolts and parts. About $51. And that's everything that you see here. So we're looking at, for the entire lower parts kit, and that includes everything that you need to assemble the lower, along with a very nice trigger, about $50. Okay, and again, that how short that break is. There's no creep on it. It's got a nice short crisp reset, and it's perfectly safe. And this just allows you to have faster follow-up shots and be a little bit more accurate. Alright, so very briefly I'm going to show you what we did and how you can get a trigger like this for about $50 for your entire lower parts kit. Now I'm briefly going to demonstrate how a trigger works in this LaRue Tactical trigger chassis, and this is basically just a polymer, kind of a polymer partial lower that just allows you to install triggers and test them. And it has some nice little cutouts so you can see the engagement surfaces right here. In a nutshell though, if you look at how this trigger and hammer are aligned, this is kind of how it fits inside your lower receiver. And as you pull the trigger, it pulls the engagement surfaces down until it no longer makes contact with the hammer, at which point the hammer comes forward, strikes the primer, and then comes back, and there'd be a disconnector right here where it catches. Okay, now we can improve how your trigger feels quite a bit by reducing some of the distance that the trigger has to travel in order to pull down. Okay, now this is done by, if you look in here where the grip screw comes through, okay, right inside there, and this is the same in a lower receiver, there's going to be this is where your grip would go on, and you would have normally a 1-inch 1/4 inch by 28 threaded bolt that goes in there, and that stops just short of flush, and it holds your grip in there solidly. Now one thing that you can do, and there's a couple of different trigger adjuster types. This is a little bit more difficult to install, but it has better results if you ever want to remove your grip, and so that's why I prefer this type, because it's a little bit harder to adjust initially, but it's still pretty simple, and it allows you to remove your grip or change it out, and you don't have to worry about damaging anything in the process. So in this case, what we're going to do is install the trigger into this chassis, and then I'll show you how the trigger adjusts. But in a nutshell, we're going to thread in a little set screw that's going to go up there and put pressure on the bottom of your trigger. This will lower the engagement surface and require less take-up in order for the trigger to break and for the action cycle to be completed. So I'm going to get this all set up inside this chassis, and then I'll show you a demonstration of how it works. Alright, so here we are mostly assembled, and as you can see, I don't have all the springs and stops in the chassis, so we're just for demonstration purposes. If you look inside this little hole here, you can see how the two trigger surfaces engage, how the hammer and the trigger interface with each other, right? Now, as you pull the trigger, when it's in fire, as you pull the trigger, notice how the hammer cams back a little bit, and that's caused as the trigger comes down, and you keep pulling until it breaks, okay? And then normally, when the bolt came back, it would force the trigger back, it would hit the disconnector right here, and then when you release the trigger, it drops off the disconnector catch back into engagement between the trigger and the hammer, the sear surface there, okay? So what we can do is we can shorten the distance and get rid of some of that creep by pre-tensioning the trigger bar. Let me pull the safety out real quick so you can see what I'm talking about. Now this trigger bar under here just so happens to coincide with the hole for the grip screw right here. Okay. Normally there's a 1-inch hole, and you'd have your trigger grip screw that goes up and holds the grip into your lower receiver. Now if you look here, what we have is a 5/8 bolt and a 3/8 set screw. Okay, and this is going to be our trigger adjuster. And the way this works is we're going to put this set screw up inside your lower receiver. Just pretend this is the lower receiver, and we're going to go ahead and thread that in there. Okay, and this takes a 1/8 inch hex driver. You can use either a bit or an Allen key. I find it's easier with an Allen key, and that's going to thread up there all the way through until it meets the bottom of the trigger bar. And once it touches that, we'll start putting pressure on that, and it'll move the engagement surfaces down just a little bit. So all it's doing is getting rid of some of that creep. It's like you're pulling the trigger just a little bit. So you're pulling past all that creep. Okay, and this is going to get real tough to thread here in a second. I had to thread the last the last quarter of an inch on this chassis, and so it's pretty tight. Okay. And when you're putting this into your lower receiver, you're going to want to have your weapon on safe. And the reason being is you're going to want to be able to feel when you can no longer move that safety. When you start feeling pressure put on that safety, see how it's really tight, and there's not even the selector on there. That means that we've moved the trigger bar up just a little bit too far. So we're going to back that down, okay, until the point where the safety switch moves freely with no felt tension. And so we'll back that down about 1/8 of a turn. There we go. That's perfect. Maybe go about 1/16 of a turn back, just to be, yep, too far. And you can kind of feel your way through, okay? The better you dial this in now, the better it'll be. Now, when you're doing this for real on your AR-15, you're going to want to have blue thread locker on that set screw. Otherwise, it'll have the potential to back down and back out. You don't want that. That blue thread locker will keep it perfectly snug. It'll never work out. I've never had one work out, and I've abused the crap out of them. Okay, so now we're ready to put our AR grip on. So we're going to put that little nub in there for the safety stop. And I'm going to go ahead and get this screwed in and assembled off camera. Alrighty, so here we are with the final product, and as you can see, we're all ready to go. Safety works just fine. I'm going to go ahead and pull the trigger. Now I want you to pay close attention to the engagement surfaces right there if you can see them. Try and move this so you can... You can see there's just still a tiny bit of creep, but it's much better than it was before. We go back, it resets just fine, hits the disconnector, we release it, it drops it off back into the initial position. And again, pull safe, nothing happens. Okay. Now, there's a couple of things to keep in mind when you're setting this up. It's a little bit finicky when you're first doing it for the first time. You don't know how far you can go or how much pressure you need to put, so you just kind of feel it out. The first time you do this, it'll take you probably 10 or 15 minutes of just backing it out and testing and backing it out and testing. But if you've done this a couple of times, you get to where you can set it and forget it in about 30 seconds or less. And it's just one of the simplest, cheapest mods out there that you can do. All you need is a 5/8 inch long bolt for the grip itself, a 3/8 inch long set screw, and just your lock nut, and that's pretty much it. Just a little bit of time. Okay. Now there's other things that you can do, like what I did here, and as you can see, I've got my homemade AccuWedge in there, but I've also got the stainless trigger set from my Anderson set. Okay. A lot of people are going to knock on Anderson, but this is actually one of the better for the money part sets that I've seen. Okay. And I've also got a JP Enterprises reduced power spring kit with enhanced reliability. A lot of times if you go too light on trigger, it won't reliably ignite military grade primers. I've never ever had that issue with this particular spring set. It's got a slightly stronger hammer spring. And the other benefit with this particular this particular lower kit is it's got a pre-bobbed hammer right from the factory, so there's less mass on the hammer. That means when you pull the trigger, it flies forward faster and it will more reliably ignite primers. So this entire lower parts kit, along with the reduced power spring set, along with the trigger adjuster that I put on there, cost me a grand total of about $50 or $51. I'd have to look exactly. But that's everything. And then you include $30 for the price of the lower, you're like $80, you know, plus buffer stock and all that. So it basically doesn't really add any or very minimal amounts of money out of the cost of your build, but the result is you get a phenomenal trigger with a great reset. And I'm not going to say it's quite as good as a drop-in trigger, but it's darn close. It's great. And that's what we're after here, is more pew, less money. So I hope this helps some of you guys out there. I'll put a couple of snapshots of some of the products that I used on this. I can't link directly, I believe, and I wouldn't want to anyway, since I'm not vouching for them. I'm just telling you what's worked for me. But I hope this helps you guys out. Hope you guys have a great 2020. And yeah, keep your stick on the ice, guys. I just want to tag a quick PS onto the end of this video. There is more than one way to skin a cat, and the kind of trigger adjuster that I showed you is considered the old school way. It's a little bit harder to set up and get working properly initially. It'll take you a few more minutes, but it is very robust and it's easy to remove. Now there's a newer kind, as you see here, and that's the 1-inch bolt that's drilled out in the middle, and then they thread in a set screw that's much smaller. This works absolutely fine, and it's much easier to set up initially because you can get everything together, your grip on and all your springs and everything, your trigger detent, or I'm sorry, your safety detent installed before you even start adjusting the trigger. So it's much easier to set it up. The downside that I've found is once you put Loctite in there and that tiny little set screw, you may have difficulty getting it out if you ever remove it. You may have difficulty backing it out, and you got to use a super long, super tiny Allen key. And it just has a tendency to get mangled or stuck if you're trying to remove it a year later. So for that reason alone, I prefer the old school method, even though it's a little bit more difficult initially to get perfect. Next, I wanted to briefly show you the components that I used on the build you saw in the video. And that is from Primary Arms, I bought the Anderson Manufacturing stainless hammer and trigger lower parts kit. So it's a complete lower parts kit, and it has a stainless hammer and trigger on it. So it's got a very smooth, polished feel on the trigger itself, much more so than a standard GI trigger. And it's got a bobbed hammer standard, which means it will swing faster and more reliably ignite primers and cartridges, especially if you're using reduced power springs. And speaking of reduced power springs, as you can see here, this is the spring kit that I use in my rifles now. It's the JP Enhanced Reliability Spring Kit, and they claim it'll get you a 3.5 to 4 pound trigger. In my experience, it's more like 4.5 to 5, which is fine. It's perfect for what I want it for. I don't want any light primer strikes or any reliability issues. That's why I use this one. There are cheaper spring kits out there, like there's a company called Caw Valley that sells their spring kit for $6.95, and it's a really light spring kit. And it generally works okay, but I have had issues with that particular spring kit giving me light primer strikes. That's why I prefer this particular spring kit. It's got a slightly higher power hammer spring on it, but it's still reduced power. So you get a nice, clean, crisp break at 4 to 5 pounds, depending on how polished your hammer and interface is. And then it'll reliably ignite any primer I've ever used it on. So the biggest thing that you want is a reliable AR above anything else, especially if we're going for just as good. We're tinkering, but we're trying to get good for cheap. So something to keep in mind. So that's all I've got, guys. I hope this helped you out a little bit. Again, I'm just giving you a little bit of my experience. There's more than one way to skin a cat. This is a cheap, decent alternative to buying expensive drop-in triggers and dropping $100, $150 on something that you can do yourself and get good results with. Maybe not quite as good, but good results with for just a few bucks. Thanks, and keep your stick on the ice.